Nora Whitaker pressed both hands flat against her unborn child and walked to the front of that church herself. Nobody dragged her. 200 people watched in silence. The man who put that baby in her belly sat 3 rows back, studying his boots. She turned and looked straight at him. Then the doors blew open. Boots hit the floorboards like a gunshot. Wyatt Callahan, the mountain man this whole town feared, walked directly to her side, took her hand, and said the words that changed everything. If that just stopped your heart, subscribe right now and stay until the very last word, because this story only gets more powerful from here. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 arrived in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, the way it always did, without mercy. The sun came up hard and early, baking the dirt roads into something resembling cracked pottery, drawing sweat from the back of every neck before a man had even finished his morning coffee. Dust hung in the air like a permanent accusation. The mountains stood in the far distance, blue and indifferent, watching everything and saying nothing. But on this particular Sunday morning, the heat wasn't the only thing suffocating. The whole town had gathered inside First Baptist Church of Silver Creek, and not one soul among them had come to pray. Nora Whitaker knew it before she even reached the front steps. She could feel it in the way Reverend Horace Aldgate had looked at her father the night before, that particular combination of pity and satisfaction that men like him wore when they believed they were doing God's work. She could feel it in the way her father, Thomas Whitaker, had barely spoken 2 words to her over breakfast. He had simply set a plate of cold biscuits in front of her, sat down across the table, and stared at the wood grain like it owed him an explanation. She had eaten those biscuits standing up because she couldn't sit without her lower back screaming at her, and because sitting across from a man who could no longer meet her eyes was its own particular kind of pain. She was 7 months along now. There was no hiding it. Not under cotton, not under shame, not under silence. She walked to church with her father 3 paces ahead of her. He did not offer his arm. He did not slow his stride to match hers. He walked like a man trying to arrive somewhere without being seen arriving, and Nora followed because there was nothing else left to do. The moment she stepped through those church doors, every conversation stopped. Not gradually, not one by one, all at once, like someone had reached into the room and snatched the sound straight out of the air. 200 faces turned toward her. She recognized most of them. Martha Calloway, who had purchased 3 loaves of her sourdough bread just last Tuesday, pressed her lips together and looked away. The Hendersons, who'd known Nora since she was small enough to ride on her father's shoulders during the 4th of July parade, shifted in their pew and found something intensely interesting to study on the floor. Pastor Aldgate stood at the pulpit with his hands folded, watching her walk at the center aisle with the patient expression who had already decided the verdict. Nora kept her chin up. She had learned that much, at least. Hold the chin up. Don't let them see you flinch. Don't give them the satisfaction of watching you come apart. She found a seat in the front pew. They had left her precisely 1 space, as though they'd planned it that way, as though her isolation had been choreographed, and she sat down and folded her hands over her belly and waited for whatever was coming. She didn't have to wait long. "We're gathered this morning," Reverend Aldgate began, his voice filling every corner of that wooden room, not in celebration, but in necessity. "There are matters before this congregation that cannot be left unaddressed if Silver Creek is to remain a community of moral character." Nora heard her father exhale somewhere behind her. She did not turn around. A woman who lives among us has brought a burden of shame upon this town. Upon her family. Aldgate's eyes moved to her face. And it falls upon this congregation as her community to address that shame directly. "Miss Whitaker," his voice sharpened, "you will stand." She stood. She did it slowly because her back hurt and because she refused to scramble to her feet like a child caught misbehaving. She pressed one hand to the pew for support, straightened herself to her full height, which wasn't much, 5'3" at best, and turned to face the room. 200 people stared back at her. "This congregation," Aldgate said, "has a right to know the name of the man who has fathered this child. A right to know whether you will be taking a husband. A right to understand how you intend to restore the honor you have brought into question." Nora looked at him steadily. "With respect, Reverend, my personal circumstances are not the congregation's business." A murmur ran through the pews. Someone in the back she couldn't see who made a sound of sharp disapproval. "They become the congregation's business," Aldgate said, with the measured patience of a man who was very much enjoying himself, "when you sit in God's house and refuse to account for yourself. I have accounted for myself every morning of my life." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "I work. I take care of my father's household. I have never asked this town for a single thing. You are asking us to look away." This came from somewhere in the middle of the congregation, a woman's voice, high and sharp. Nora identified it without looking. Clara Mathers, who ran the dressmaking shop on Elm Street and had been competing with Nora's mother's needlework for 20 years, long after Nora's mother was in the ground. "You are asking decent people to pretend there's nothing shameful about what you've done." "I'm asking nothing from any of you," Nora said the name. Aldgate's voice dropped lower, which somehow made it carry further. "Give this congregation the name, Miss Whittaker. That is all that is required of you." And there it was, the thing they'd all come for. The piece of information that, once spoken aloud in this room, would either destroy her completely or destroy someone far more powerful than her. She had spent 7 months turning it over in her mind, examining it from every angle the way you'd examine a stone, before deciding whether to throw it. She knew what naming that name would cost. She knew whose family it would touch, what machinery it would set in motion, who would bear the brunt of the retaliation. Not her. She had already lost everything she was going to lose from this town. Her father's store. That was what she was protecting. The little dry goods shop on Main Street that had her grandfather's name above the door, that her father had built back up after the hard years following her mother's death, that was the only thing standing between Thomas Whittaker and ruin. If she named Calhoun Pierce Edmund Pierce's son, heir to the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, the Pierce family would call in every debt her father owed them before sundown. And Thomas Whittaker owed them plenty, so she stayed quiet. "I will not be giving a name," she said. The room erupted. Not loudly. These were church people, and they kept it controlled. But it erupted nonetheless in the rapid turning of heads, the urgent whispered exchanges, the way the sound level tripled in the space of 3 seconds. Aldgate held up a hand for quiet and got it, but barely. "Then this congregation has no choice," he said, "but to recommend that you remove yourself from this community until such time as—" The doors blew open, not the gentle swing of someone arriving late. They hit the interior wall with a crack like a rifle shot, and every head in that church spun toward the back of the room with the reflexive panting of people who had spent their lives in a territory where loud, sudden sounds meant danger. The figure in the doorway was backlit by the brutal summer sun, and for just a moment he was nothing but a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, the brim of a battered hat cutting a sharp line across the light. Dust rose from the road outside in slow golden curtains behind him. Then he stepped inside, and people recognized him, and the murmuring that had been building in the pews died entirely. Wyatt Callahan. Nora had not seen him in over a year. She barely knew him. 4 conversations, maybe 5, the kind of brief exchanges that happened when a mountain man came down for supplies and a shopkeeper's daughter had the inventory he needed. He'd never said more than 12 words to her at a time. She knew his name the way everyone in Silver Creek knew his name, as a warning almost. The man on the mountain, the one who'd gone up there after his wife died and hadn't really come back down. Keeps to himself, doesn't bother anyone. Don't bother him either. He wasn't frightening to look at exactly. He was just large. Solidly built in the way of men who worked with their hands and their bodies for a living, not in a gym. not to look a particular way, but because the land required it of them, and they had obliged. His hair was dark brown and wanted cutting. He had a beard, neatly kept, which surprised people who expected someone like him to look unkempt. His eyes were a particular shade of blue that Nora remembered, because they were the eyes of a man who had learned to be very careful about what he let show in them. He walked down the center aisle of First Baptist Church of Silver Creek the way he probably walked every other place he went, like the space belonged to him not by right, but by simple physics, because he occupied it, and therefore it was his. He did not look at the reverend. He did not look at the congregation. He did not look at Clara Mathers, or the Hendersons, or any of the 200 people who had turned to stare at him. He looked at Nora, just at her, like she was the only fixed point in the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She could smell horses and pine and road dust and something underneath that, something clean. She had no idea what he was doing here. She had absolutely no idea what he was about to do. And her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she thought, dimly, hysterically, that it was almost funny she had stood here calm in front of 200 people who despised her, and this man who was presumably trying to help her was the one making her pulse lose its rhythm. He turned his head slowly and looked at Reverend Aldgate. "You want the name," he said. His voice was low, not aggressive, not loud. Just the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it already had a quality of certainty that made raising it unnecessary. Aldgate blinked. "Mister, this is a private church matter and you have no business." "You want the name," Wyatt said again, exactly the same way, as if the Reverend hadn't spoken at all. He reached out and took Nora's hand. She felt it, the size of his hand around hers, the roughness of calluses across his palm, the warmth. She did not pull away. She wasn't sure she could have, even if she'd wanted to. "Then write mine." He met her eyes for just a moment. Something in his gaze, steady, certain, asking nothing in return, made her chest constrict. "That child has my name." The silence that followed was the most complete silence Nora Whittaker had ever experienced in her 25 years of living. It wasn't the silence of shock, though there was shock in it. It was the silence of 200 people recalculating everything they thought they knew, and finding that the math no longer added up. Then everyone started talking at once. Reverend Aldgate recovered first. He had to. It was his church, his proceeding, his carefully constructed morning of public reckoning, and a mountain man in a dusty vest had just walked in and upended every bit of it. Mr. Callahan. His voice had taken on a new quality, something careful and wary that hadn't been there before. "You are making a very serious claim." "I don't make claims I don't mean." Wyatt still hadn't let go of Nora's hand. She hadn't asked him to. She wasn't going to. This is highly irregular," Aldgate sputtered. "We have no record of any relationship between you and Miss Whittaker." "No courtship was announced." "No, do you announce every private thing in your life to this congregation, Reverend?" Wyatt asked. His voice was perfectly pleasant, because if so, I imagine Sunday services run long. A sound from the pews surprised, quickly suppressed. Someone had almost laughed. Clara Mathers did not find it amusing. She rose halfway from her seat, the brim of her Sunday hat trembling with the force of her indignation. "This is absurd. This man hasn't been seen in Silver Creek in over a year. He lives alone on that mountain like an animal. Are we truly to believe that he and Eleanor Whittaker have been? You're welcome to believe whatever you like, ma'am." Wyatt turned his blue eyes on her, with a calm so total it seemed almost aggressive. "You generally do." Clara sat back down. Nora's father pushed through to the front of the congregation. Thomas Whittaker was 54 years old, and had the look of a man who had been beaten down by life enough times that he'd stopped bothering to fully stand back up. He was pale now, paler than the summer heat warranted, and his eyes moved between his daughter and the man standing beside her with an expression that was doing its best to decide whether to be grateful or furious. "Nora." His voice was strained. "What is the meaning of this?" She looked at her father. She loved him. She had always loved him, even when loving him meant swallowing everything she felt so he wouldn't have to carry it. Papa, is this true? Is this? He gestured helplessly at Wyatt Callahan, at the hand holding hers, at the whole impossible situation. Do you know this man? I do, she said quietly. Thomas Whitaker looked at Wyatt with the particular expression of a man who was too tired to be properly angry. And you are claiming responsibility for my daughters, for this situation. I am, Wyatt said. Why? Thomas asked, and the rawness in that single word, the genuine bewildered why, caught Nora off guard. Wyatt considered the question like he meant to answer it honestly. Because somebody ought to. They left the church together. Wyatt walked out first, still holding her hand, and Nora had the disorienting experience of feeling every eye in the building follow them as they moved down the center aisle. She kept her chin up. She kept her hand steady in his. She did not look at any of them. Outside, the sun hit like a physical blow after the interior dimness. The street was empty. Everyone was inside, presumably still buzzing, and Nora finally let out the breath she'd been holding since those doors blew open. Wyatt released her hand. She turned to face him. He was studying her with the same careful attention he'd shown inside, like he was reading something in her face that she hadn't intended to put there. It was disconcerting. She wasn't used to being read. Why did you do that? She asked. He pushed his hat back slightly, which she was coming to understand might be his version of a deep breath. I heard what they were planning. From who? Dale Ferris. At the feed store. He wasn't proud of it, for what it's worth. He mentioned it, trying to see if I'd weigh in. I weighed in. Nora stared at him. You rode down from your mountain because a feed store clerk mentioned what they were doing to me? I rode down because it was wrong. He said it simply, without drama, the way he might have said the sky was blue or water ran downhill. They were going to drive you out of town. I heard it. I didn't think that was right. You don't even know me. I know enough. When she kept staring at him, he shifted slightly, something almost uncomfortable moving through his expression. I remember you gave my neighbor's widow 3 weeks of bread credit when her husband died and everyone else was waiting for her to fail. I remember you sat with old Mrs. Hargrove for 2 hours in the rain because she'd had a bad spell and had no one else. I asked around about you, Miss Whitaker. When I do a thing, I like to be sure it's worth doing. Nora didn't know what to do with any of that. She pressed her lips together and tried to organize herself. Mr. Callahan, what you did in there, what you said. It's done now. It's going to cause you problems. Problems don't scare me much. They'll say all manner of things about you. One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. They already say all manner of things about me. I haven't noticed it affecting my livestock. She almost laughed. It surprised her enough that she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and he watched her do it with something in his eyes that was very quiet and very warm. Then she sobered, because there were real things to discuss. Serious things. What do we do now? They're going to expect, they're going to want, people will be watching to see if you. I'd like you to come up to my place for a while, he said. She stared at him. Not permanently. Not if you don't want it to be. But they're going to make your life in this town very difficult, Miss Whitaker, especially now that they know you've got someone backing you up. Edmund Pierce isn't going to like what happened in there. He's a proud man, and I've just made him look like he failed to handle a situation. The quiet steadiness in his voice didn't waver. You and the baby will be safer somewhere he's not inclined to follow. You're offering me refuge on your mountain. I'm offering you a safe place to be. Yes, ma'am. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father's store. She thought about Edmund Pierce's face when he heard what had happened this morning, because he would hear a man like that had ears everywhere. She thought about the cold biscuits at breakfast and the way her father had refused to look at her and the sound of 200 voices erupting in that church when she refused to give a name. She thought about what Wyatt Callahan had said to the Reverend. Then right mine. You barely know me, she said again. That's true, he agreed. You're taking on a situation that isn't yours to take on. Also true. And you're doing it for a woman you've had maybe 5 conversations with in your life. He looked at her steadily. You want me to have a better reason than the one I've got? She didn't answer. She couldn't quite.
I've got a spare room, he said.
And I cook well enough to keep a person alive. And nobody comes up my mountain without my knowing about it. That's what I can offer you. Nora looked down at her hands. Her belly, the road beneath her feet. Then she looked back up at him. I'll need to get some things from my father's house, she said. Something in his shoulders released not a dramatic change, just a small shift, like a man who'd been braced for a harder answer. I'll wait. Her father was waiting on the porch when she got there. Thomas Whitaker had aged 10 years in the 20 minutes since she'd last seen him. He sat on the front steps with his hat in his hands and his elbows on his knees, and when he heard her come up the walk, he looked at her with the face of a man trying to work out how much of what had just happened was his fault. The answer, if he was being honest, was considerable. Nora, his voice was rough. I'm going to get my things, Papa. He stood up. Wait, just wait a minute. She waited. He turned his hat in his hands. It was a nervous habit she'd known her whole life, and watching it now made something ache in her chest, some combination of love and grief, and a particular kind of loneliness that you could only feel for someone who was still alive. Did I do right by you, he asked, these past months? Did I? No, she said. The word fell between them like something dropped from a height. He winced. No, she said again, not cruelly, but without softening it. You didn't. You looked away from me every morning, and I had to carry that on top of everything else I was already carrying. And I know why you did it. I know you were scared about the store, and about Pierce, and about what people would say. I know all of that. But you were supposed to be my father, and you weren't, and I need you to know that I know. Thomas Whitaker looked at his hat. A muscle moved in his jaw. I'm sorry. Without excuse, Nora let that sit. She believed him, which didn't make it hurt less. I'm going up to Mr. Callahan's place, she said, for a while. Until after the baby comes, at least. Until I can figure out what comes next. Callahan, her father said the name carefully. Do you trust him? She thought about it honestly. She had known Wyatt Callahan for approximately 45 minutes in any meaningful sense of the word. She knew what he'd done, and she knew what he'd said, and she knew that he'd come down from his mountain for a woman he barely knew, because he'd decided it was wrong to leave her to face it alone. Yes, she said. Her father nodded slowly. He didn't argue. She wasn't sure he had the energy for it, or perhaps he had simply run out of the right to. I'll keep the store open, she said. I'll keep your accounts straight. I can do the books from up there and bring them down when I need to. Nora, I'm still your daughter, Papa. Her voice was steady. That hasn't changed. But I need to be somewhere safe right now, and this isn't it. Not yet. He reached out and touched her arm. Just for a moment, and then he took his hand back. You'll send word? Let me know you're all right? I will. She went inside and packed a canvas bag with what she needed. She was efficient about it. She'd always been efficient. It was a quality born of a household that didn't have room for waste. 2 dresses, her wool shawl, because mountain nights were cold even in summer. Her mother's Bible, the small tin box where she kept her money, which wasn't much. The jar of her own bread starter, because she wasn't leaving that behind for anything. She came back out to find Wyatt waiting at the foot of the steps. He had 2 horses. One she recognized as a large bay gelding with the easy patience of an animal that had logged a lot of mountain trail miles. The other was a smaller sorrel mare with a gentle eye. She's steady, he said, nodding at the sorrel. Won't spook. I can ride, Nora said. I know, Dale Ferris mentioned it. He took her bag and lashed it to the back of his own saddle without being asked. You want help up? I'm fine. She got herself up into the saddle. It took a moment, because 7 months of pregnancy changed the geometry of everything, but she managed it. and she settled in and gathered her reins, and didn't look at him to see if he was going to make something of the slight awkwardness of it. He didn't. He was already mounting his own horse. They rode out of Silver Creek together, side by side, down the main street with the summer heat pressing down on them from above and the dust rising around the horses' hooves. A few people watched from doorways and windows. Nora felt the weight of their gaze and let it pass through her. At the edge of town, where the road turned north toward the mountain trail, she heard a voice call out. She didn't need to turn to know it was Calhoun Pierce. He was standing outside his father's law office, handsome in the way of men who'd always been told they were handsome and had never had reason to question it. 27 years old, and carrying himself with the authority of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He had heard then. "Miss Whitaker," he called. She kept riding. "You're making a mistake." His voice had an edge in it now, something that wanted to be contempt but was actually something closer to fear. Nora had heard both enough to know the difference. "You think this changes anything? You think this mountain man is going to protect you from?" "From what, Pierce?" Wyatt's voice. He had stopped his horse and turned, and he was looking at Calhoun Pierce with those blue eyes that didn't let you see what was behind them, and his voice carried the same perfect absence of agitation it always seemed to carry. Calhoun Pierce opened his mouth. "Closed it from what?" Wyatt said again. Same tone. Finished the sentence. A long moment passed. Nora watched Calhoun Pierce decide whether he wanted this particular fight, weigh it, and determined that he did not today, not here, in the middle of the street where everyone could see him. "This isn't over," he said instead. "No," Wyatt agreed pleasantly, "I don't expect it is." He turned his horse back north, and Nora fell in beside him, and they rode. The mountain trail opened up before them like the land exhaling. The pine trees thickened on either side, and the temperature dropped by degrees as they climbed. And the sounds of Silver Creek fell away behind them until there was nothing left but the wind and the horses breathing and the occasional call of something in the trees. They rode in silence for a long time. It wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised her. She'd expected it to be. She'd expected the weight of what had just happened, the enormity of the morning, the sheer strangeness of riding away from her entire life beside a near stranger, to make the silence feel unbearable. Instead, it felt like the first quiet thing she'd had in months. She looked at Wyatt's profile, the set of his jaw, the ease with which he sat his horse, the way he watched the trail ahead with a calm, unhurried attention. He wasn't thinking about the scene in the church, she realized. Or if he was, he'd already folded it away somewhere and moved past it. He was simply here on this trail, watching for what came next. "Mr. Callahan," she said. He glanced at her. "Wyatt." Wyatt. The name felt strange in her mouth and then, quickly, less strange. "What happens when your neighbors find out? When people up here learn that you've brought a woman back to your place? A pregnant, unmarried woman from the valley that the whole town has been gossiping about." He considered the trail ahead. "Most of my neighbors mind their business. That's why they live up here. And the ones who don't. There aren't many of those." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got a good reputation on this mountain, Miss Whitaker." "Nora, I've kept it deliberately and it's served me well. If I say something's right, people up here generally believe me. You won't be met with what you met this morning." She held on to that. "There's something else," he said, after another stretch of trail. "What?" "Edmund Pierce." He said the name flatly, without inflection. He didn't get to be the most powerful man in 3 counties by letting things go that embarrassed him. I made a move this morning that cut against him pretty directly. He's going to want to answer it. I know. I want you to know that I know it too. I'm not naive about what this cost." His eyes stayed on the trail. "But I've got something Pierce doesn't have up here." "What's that?" "Home ground." He said it the way you'd say something that simply was a fact as plain as weather. "He comes up this mountain, he's on my terrain. I've had 2 years to know every foot of it. That's worth a great deal. Nora absorbed this, the logic of it, but also something underneath the logic, the particular quality of certainty in his voice. Not arrogance, something quieter, the certainty of a man who had already made his calculations and was at peace with them. You thought this through, she said, before you came down this morning. You thought it through. I did. You planned for the possibility that Pierce would push back. I planned for the certainty of it. She looked at him. And you came anyway. He turned his head and met her eyes. Just briefly. I came anyway. The trail curved around a bend, and, ahead of them, through a gap in the pines, she could see for the first time the rough, beautiful shape of the valley falling away below and the mountains rising above. The scale of it hit her like cold water, the sheer size of the world up here. The problems of Silver Creek seemed to shrink against the enormous indifference of all that stone and sky and timber. She breathed, really breathed, for the first time in months it felt like. The baby moved a small, firm presence shifting its weight, and she put a hand on her belly automatically, and the sorrel mare walked steadily on, and Wyatt Callahan rode beside her without asking what she was thinking. And the mountain accepted them both without judgment. It was not, she would think later, what she'd expected rescue to feel like. She hadn't expected it to feel like breathing. Wyatt's cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, where the pines broke open and the sky came rushing in wide and blue and indifferent to the troubles of valley towns. Nora had not known what to expect. She had built a version of it in her mind on the ride-up, rough, dark, the kind of place a man lived when he'd stopped caring about living well. A place that smelled like isolation. She was wrong. It was small, yes. One main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area along the back wall, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow hallway leading to what she assumed were the sleeping rooms. But it was clean. Deliberately, carefully clean, the kind of clean that doesn't happen by accident, that requires regular attention and a particular respect for the space you inhabit. The floor had been swept recently. The dishes on the shelf were stacked with precision. There were no cobwebs in the corners. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, and revised everything she thought she'd known about Wyatt Callahan. Spare rooms down the hall, he said, setting her bag on the table. It was a storage room, mostly, but I cleared it out last night and put a bed in. It's not much. She turned to look at him. Last night? He held her gaze without flinching. I told you. I thought through the possibilities. He had cleared out a room for her before he'd even ridden down to Silver Creek. Before he knew whether she'd accept. Before he knew whether his intervention would even work. He had simply decided it was the right thing to do and prepared for the outcome he intended. Nora did not know what to do with a man like that. She had spent her entire life in a town full of people who said the right things and then carefully calculated whether acting on them was worth the cost. She had never met anyone who simply acted. I'd like to see it, she said. It was small. He hadn't lied about that. But the bed was solid and the mattress was stuffed with fresh straw, and he had put a quilt on it that she recognized as good work, heavy, well-stitched, the kind made to last. There was a small window that looked out toward the tree line, and the light that came through it in the late afternoon was the particular golden color that made everything look like a painting of itself. It'll do, she said. Good. He headed back toward the main room. I'll start supper. She followed him and stood in the kitchen's doorway watching him work. He moved around the space without wasted motion, a man who cooked regularly. She could see that immediately, who knew where everything was without having to look. He put water on to heat and brought out salt pork and dried beans from the larder and started cutting onion on the board, and he didn't look up at her or make conversation about any of it. You cook, she said. Have to. He swept the onion into the pot. Nobody else up here to do it. Most men I know would let themselves starve before they'd learn to cook. Then most men you know are foolish. He said it matter-of-factly, without judgment. Hunger doesn't care about pride, she almost smiled. She caught it before it fully formed and turned back to studying the main room instead. And the truth was, she didn't want to smile yet. She wasn't ready for things to feel manageable. She'd been bracing herself for the next disaster for so long that the absence of immediate crisis felt like its own kind of danger, like the moment just before the roof comes down, when everything goes very, very still. The baby shifted again. She pressed her hand flat against her belly, feeling the movement settle. "When are you due?" he asked. He hadn't looked up from the pot. 6 weeks, maybe 7. She paused. "Dr. Holt in town has been well. He won't be seeing me again." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "There's a woman up on the North Ridge, Helena Burke. She's brought more babies into the world than Dr. Holt has had years of practice. I'll send word to her in the morning." Nora looked at the back of his head. "You have all of this figured out." "Not all of it." He turned and looked at her then, and there was something honest in his eyes that cut through the steadiness she'd been relying on. "I know how to keep you safe on this mountain. I know this terrain, and I know these people, and I know what Pierce is likely to do and what he's not. But I don't know." He stopped, started again. "I don't know much about what you're going through. Carrying. What you need for that. So I'll need you to tell me." She stared at him. "I'm not a man who reads minds," he said. "If something's wrong or you need something, I'd rather you say it directly than wait for me to figure it out." It was, she realized, the most words he had strung together at once since she'd known him. And he'd used all of them to tell her he didn't know something, which was not what men generally volunteered. "I need to keep busy," she said after a moment. "If I sit still, I think too much, and that doesn't help anyone." He nodded. "There's work to be done, and I'd like to keep the accounts for my father's store. If you're willing to take a ride down the mountain once a week or so, I can send the ledger corrections with you. That's manageable." And she stopped, and she pushed past the small embarrassment of it. "I'd like to start a garden. I know it's late in the season for most things, but there are greens that'll take in this soil, and I need something with roots. Something I can watch grow." He looked at her for a moment, and she couldn't entirely read what was in his expression, but it wasn't pity, and it wasn't amusement. It was something more careful than either. "I've got a patch on the south side that gets good sun," he said. "It's yours." That night she lay in the small room with the golden light window and listened to the mountains settle around her. The pines moved. Something called in the dark, far off. The cabin held its quiet. She put her hand on her belly and felt the baby turn slowly, finding its position. And she thought about the morning that had just passed with the detached attention of someone cataloging damage after a storm. She had lost the town. She had known she was losing it by degrees for months, but now it was formal, official, witnessed. 200 people had looked at her and made their decision. She thought about her father's face, the exhausted sorrow in it, and the relief underneath the sorrow, the relief that someone else had stepped in and solved the problem he'd been too afraid to solve himself. She recognized that relief, and she resented it, and she understood it all at the same time, and none of those three things were comfortable to hold simultaneously. She thought about Calhoun Pierce standing in front of his father's office, his handsome face gone tight and strange, and the way fear had moved behind his eyes when Wyatt turned and looked at him. Wyatt. She thought about him for longer than she intended to. About the way he'd walked into that church, like he'd calculated exactly what the room would do, and had already decided he didn't care. About the steadiness of his hand around hers. About the spare room he'd prepared before he even knew she'd need it. About the way he'd said, "I've got something Pierce doesn't have up here." Home ground. She fell asleep with that thought, and, for the first time in many months, she slept without waking. The days that followed had a shape to them that surprised her. She had expected discomfort. The particular strain of two strangers learning to share a space, the awkward negotiations over who used what and when, the constant low-level awareness of another person's presence in rooms that had been built for solitude. She had braced for it, the way she'd been bracing for everything. Instead, what happened was quiet. Functional. Almost easy. In the way that things sometimes are when both people involved have decided to be practical about it and leave their pride somewhere else. Wyatt rose before dawn. She knew this because the sound of him moving through the cabin careful, deliberate, not trying to be silent exactly, but clearly accustomed to not disturbing a sleeping household that no longer existed woke her on the first morning. And after that she found herself waking before him, lying still in the early dark, listening to the world outside the window transition from night sounds to morning sounds in the incremental way it does when you're paying attention. He made coffee. She started taking hers outside, sitting on the front step while the mountain came into focus around her. He didn't follow. He seemed to understand, without being told, that the early morning was the time she needed to be alone with her thoughts, and he gave it to her without making a thing of it. By mid-morning she was in the garden. She'd found seeds in the storage shed, turnips and radishes, and a variquete of kale that would come in fast, and she put them in rows with the focused attention of a woman who needed something to tend. The soil was good. Dark and loamy, slightly cold from the altitude, but good. She worked the rows with a hoe she found hanging on the shed wall and talked to the baby while she worked, which was something she'd started doing privately 2 months ago and had never admitted to anyone. She told the baby about the seeds, about what would come up first and what would take longer, about the difference between the radishes, which would show green in a week if conditions were right, and the turnips, which were slower and more stubborn and required patience. She was explaining turnip patience when she heard boots on the ground behind her. She didn't startle. She'd already learned the particular sound of Wyatt's footfall heavier on the right than the left. She'd noticed, from some old injury he'd never mentioned. She kept hoeing. "You're talking to yourself," he said. "I'm talking to the baby." A pause. "Does it?" He seemed to reconsider the question. "Does that help?" "I think it does." She stopped hoeing and straightened up, pressing one hand to the small of her back. "My mother used to say that babies know voices before they know anything else. That they come into the world already knowing who belongs to them." He was quiet. Something moved through his expression, quick and private, a flash of something she didn't have a name for, and then it was gone. "My wife used to say something like that," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned her. Nora knew, in the vague way that valley gossip reached everywhere eventually, that Wyatt Callahan had been married. That he'd lost her. That this was, by most accounts, the reason for the solitary life on the mountain. She had not pressed him on it, had not asked, had not indicated in any way that she knew. "What was her name?" she asked. "Clara." He said it without visible pain, which she had learned didn't mean the pain wasn't there. "She died 3 years ago. She was expecting." It went wrong. Nora held very still, both of them, he said. She and the baby both. The weight of that landed on her carefully, the way you set something fragile down. She thought about the room he'd cleared, and the solid bed, and the heavy quilt and Helena Burke on the North Ridge, and she understood suddenly why he'd thought of all of it without being asked. Why he'd been so meticulous about the preparation. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it plainly, without the excessive softening that people sometimes wrapped around grief as if they could cushion it. "So am I." He looked at the garden. It was a long time ago. "I've made my peace with it." A brief pause, "Mostly." She nodded. She understood about mostly. "You should eat something," he said. "You've been out here since 7. It's not noon yet." "You're growing a person. Noon doesn't matter." She looked at him. He was still looking at the garden with the focused attention of a man who had said more than he meant to and was rerouting himself back to practical territory. She felt a sudden, clear warmth for him, not romantic, not yet. Nothing so defined as that, but the particular warmth you feel for someone who has shown you a real thing about themselves and trusted you not to make too much of it. "I'll come in when I've done this row," she said. "Fine." He turned back toward the cabin. "I'll make something." 3 days in, she found the cradle. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for a second candle, which she thought she'd seen in the storage shed, and she'd opened what she thought was a supply cabinet, and found instead a small wooden cradle pushed back against the wall. It was covered with a drop cloth. She lifted the cloth and looked at it for a long moment. It was beautiful work. Simple joinery, smooth planes, the wood sanded to a finish that had clearly taken time. A craftsman had made this, or a man who had taught himself to be one out of love and anticipation. She put the cloth back and didn't say anything about it. But she thought about it all afternoon, and by evening she had arrived at a clear, quiet grief for Wyatt Callahan that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. She knew what it was to lose something before it could begin. The shape of that loss was one she understood from her own territory. She was sitting at the table after supper, working through her father's ledger by lamplight, when she heard him moving in the shed. Steady sound sawing, then planing. She listened to the rhythm of it without looking up. After a while she said, "Are you building something?" The sound stopped. "Cabinet," he said, through the open window. "For the spare room. You could use the storage." She looked back at her ledger. "Thank you." The sounds resumed. On the 5th morning, the first rider came up the trail. Wyatt saw him before she did. She was in the kitchen and heard him move to the front window with that particular deliberate quality in his step that was different from his ordinary movement. She came out of the kitchen and found him standing at the edge of the porch, arms loose at his sides, watching the trail. The rider was a young man she didn't recognize. Maybe 20 years old, lean and nervous looking, wearing clothes that were too good for the mountain and sitting his horse, like someone who'd been told to go somewhere he didn't particularly want to go. "That's one of the Pierce Ranch hands," Wyatt said. "Quiet. Certain I recognized the brand on the horse." The young man pulled up at the edge of the clearing. He looked at Wyatt, and then at Nora, and then back at Wyatt with the expression of someone who had been given a job he wished had fallen to someone else. "Mr. Callahan." He held up both hands showing empty palms. "I've got a message from Mr. Edmund Pierce." "Speak it," Wyatt said. The young man reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper. "He said I was to hand it over. Said you'd understand it. Leave it at the post there." The hand looked at the fence post, leaned over and tucked the paper into the gap between two rails. Then he looked at Wyatt one more time, and at Nora, and whatever he saw in Wyatt's stillness made him decide that asking any questions would be a mistake. He turned his horse and rode back down the trail without another word. Wyatt waited until the horse sounds faded entirely. Then he walked to the post and took the paper and unfolded it and read it. His expression didn't change. He folded it again and held it for a moment. "What does it say?" Nora asked. He looked at her. "Pierce is requesting that you come back down to Silver Creek voluntarily. He says he has concerns about your welfare." He paused. "He says if you don't come voluntarily, he'll have cause to send the sheriff." The word hit her like cold water. "On what grounds?" "He says a man living alone on a mountain is not a suitable guardian for a woman in your condition. He says if I won't bring you back, he'll argue to the territorial court that you're being held against your will." Nora felt the blood leave her face, and then felt anger fill the space it left. That's absurd. He knows exactly what it is," Wyatt said. His voice was completely steady. "It's a pressure tactic. He's not going to the territorial court. It would take weeks, and a judge would want to hear from you directly. And the last thing Edmund Pierce wants is a territorial judge asking questions about this situation." He looked back down the trail the hand had taken. "He's hoping you'll panic," she breathed, steadied herself. "Will it work? Can he actually?" "Certain. Not if you tell me plainly that you're here of your own choice and don't want to leave." "I am," she said, "and I don't. Then we have nothing to worry about from the territorial court." She looked at the letter in his hand. "What are you going to do with that?" He folded it in half again. "Keep it. Evidence that he's aware of our location and has made contact." He looked at her. "Do you have any letters? Any records that connect Calhoun Pierce to you? Nora thought. Then slowly, yes. When it happened, I wrote it all down. Dates, what he said, where we were. I put it in the tin box I keep with my things. I thought maybe someday. She stopped. Someday you might need it. Yes, something moved through his eyes, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of focused respect. Good. I want you to keep it safe. Don't tell me where you've put it if Pierce's people come looking and they get to me first. I can honestly say I don't know. She stared at him. He had thought of this. He had already thought all of this through. Was 2, 3 steps ahead, moving through contingencies, like a man who had learned to play a long game and was not particularly worried about the opening moves. Wyatt. He looked at her. Why are you doing all of this? She asked. Not the version of the question she'd asked on the street in Silver Creek. That one had been about the initial act, the impulse, the single decision to walk into a church and say 4 words. This question was about the sustained effort. The room and the cradle and Helena Burke on the North Ridge, and now this, the careful management of an enemy's approach. Why are you building? She searched for the right word. A campaign. On my behalf. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, because I've watched good people get crushed by men like Edmund Pierce before. I've watched it happen and done nothing, and it has not sat well with me. This is penance? No. He met her eyes. I don't believe in penance much. I believe in deciding what kind of man you want to be, and then being it consistently, even when it costs you something. He looked back toward the trail. Pierce has spent his whole life building power out of other people's silence. I don't intend to be silent. She held that. She turned it over. She thought about the town of Silver Creek and the way power worked there in favors owed and debts called, and the particular silence of people who had calculated the cost of speaking. She thought about her own silence and what it had cost her. I should have told the truth months ago, she said. Not to him. To herself. Maybe, he said, without judgment. But you were protecting your father. That's not nothing. It didn't protect him. She stopped. I know. His voice was quiet. Fear doesn't always protect the people we're afraid for. It mostly just delays the thing we feared. She looked at him. Is that your philosophy? Generally? It's what I've learned. He turned and headed back toward the cabin. Come inside. I'll make coffee. She followed him, and behind them the mountain went on with its own business, and somewhere below in the valley, Edmund Pierce was reading the response he hadn't gotten and deciding what to do next. The answer came 8 days later, not from Edmund Pierce. From her father. She was in the garden when she heard Wyatt's horse returning from his weekly supply run. She stood and shaded her eyes and watched him into the clearing, and she could tell before he dismounted that something was different. Not alarmed, Wyatt's face was very difficult to read in the register of alarmed, but different. Tight around the jaw in a way it wasn't usually. He came straight to the garden. Your father sent a letter with me, he said, and held it out. She wiped her hands on her apron and took it and opened it. Thomas Whitaker had never been a man of many words, written or otherwise. The letter was 4 sentences. Nora. Pierce has called in the loan on the building. I have 30 days. I don't know what to do. She read it twice. Then she held it in both hands and looked at the mountain above the tree line and felt something settle in her that was very far past surprise. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the morning in the church, if not before. Edmund Pierce was a man who believed in thoroughness, and calling in her father's debt was the most obvious move available to him. It would pressure her, destabilize whatever arrangement she'd built up here on the mountain, and punish Thomas Whitaker for failing to control his daughter more effectively. How much? He doesn't say. She lowered the letter. But the building's worth about $600. Pierce will have lent against more than that, knowing my father. Wyatt's jaw worked once. Nora. She looked at him. I have money. He said it with the same ease he'd said everything else, not making it bigger than it was, not performing generosity. Not a great deal, but enough. I've been putting aside since Clara died because there wasn't anything else to spend it on. If $600 would cover the debt. No, she said. He stopped. No, she said again, and her voice was completely steady. I won't take your savings, Wyatt. Not for this. It's not. It's not charity, I know. You weren't framing it that way. But, she pressed her lips together. Pierce will just find another way. He'll call in the next debt and the one after that. If we pay this one, we're just buying my father another 30 days of breathing room before the next attack. She folded the letter. That's not how you fight Edmund Pierce. He looked at her steadily. How do you fight Edmund Pierce? She had been thinking about this for 8 days, actually. Since the letter from Pierce himself. She had lain awake with the turnip patience she'd described to her unborn child and worked the problem from every angle she could reach. You expose him, she said. Not to Silver Creek. Silver Creek already knows and has decided his money matters more than the truth. You expose him to someone with more power than he has. She met Wyatt's eyes. Does the territorial court ride through here? A circuit judge. Something shifted in Wyatt's face. Judge Harlan Booth. He comes through Clearwater, about 40 miles north. Every 3 months. When's the next circuit? A pause.
6 weeks.
She was due in 6 weeks, maybe 7. She almost laughed. The timing of things, she thought the sheer indifference of events to personal convenience. I need to get a formal statement to Judge Booth, she said. A written account of what Calhoun Pierce did, dated, specific, with whatever I have to corroborate it. If a circuit judge issues an inquiry, Pierce can't just ignore it the way he ignores everything else. He'll have to respond. And a man like that, when he has to respond publicly, in front of someone with real authority. He makes mistakes, Wyatt said. He makes mistakes, she confirmed. They looked at each other. The late afternoon light was coming through the trees, and the garden smelled of turned earth, and somewhere above them a hawk was making long, slow circles. I know how to get a letter to Judge Booth, Wyatt said. I've dealt with his office before. Land dispute with a neighbor, 2 years ago. It was settled fairly. Will he listen? To a woman's account? With Harlan Booth is a man who follows evidence, Wyatt said. He doesn't follow money, which is why the Pierce family doesn't much care for him. That counts for a great deal. Nora nodded. She thought about the tin box. The dates, the details, the record she'd kept, with the careful hand of a woman who had known, somewhere underneath the fear, that silence was only a temporary solution. I'll write it tonight, she said. Take your time and do it right, Wyatt said. One chance to make a first impression on a circuit judge. She looked at him, at the contained steadiness of him, the particular quality of his attention, which was the attention of a man who had decided to be fully present for something and was not going to be moved from it by inconvenience or cost. She thought about the letter in her pocket, her father's 4 sentences of defeat. She thought about 30 days, and 6 weeks, and a circuit judge 40 miles north, and the careful record she'd kept in a tin box. I'm going to need more lamp oil, she said. One corner of his mouth shifted. I'll get it. She turned back to the garden and started pulling the tools together, and the mountain held them both in its enormous, patient quiet, and below in Silver Creek, Edmund Pierce was sitting in his good chair in his good house, counting his debts and his power and his certainties, not yet aware that 6 weeks away, a woman on a mountain was writing down everything she remembered, in her clear, careful hand, by lamplight. She sent the letter to Judge Harlan Booth on a Tuesday morning, folded inside a second envelope addressed to a law clerk in Clearwater that Wyatt knew by name. She had written it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first draft was too emotional. She could feel the anger bleeding through the language in ways that would undermine her credibility with a man who dealt in evidence. The second was too dry, stripped of the human reality of what had happened until it read like a property dispute rather than what it actually was. The third found the register she was looking for, precise, chronological, specific, and utterly without self-pity. She included dates. She included exact words Calhoun Pierce had spoken to her. She had written them down within days of the incident, while they were still acid-sharp in her memory, and that record had not softened or blurred in the months since. She included the names of 2 people who had seen Calhoun Pierce in her company on the relevant evenings, people who had no particular reason to lie for her and no particular reason to lie for him. She included a clear statement of what had been offered to her family in exchange for her silence, and by whom it had been offered. She did not include anything she could not prove or substantiate. She did not speculate. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for an inquiry. When Wyatt read it before they sealed it, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is a good letter, Nora. Is it enough?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it's the right kind of enough. It gives a fair man something to work with." She sealed it herself. She pressed the wax with the flat of a knife, because she didn't have a proper seal, and she held it for a moment before she handed it to Wyatt, feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing, a few sheets of paper in an envelope. Barely more than air, and thinking about how strange it was that the most consequential things were so often nearly weightless. "Ride safe," she said, "always do." He pocketed the letter. "I'll check on your father's store while I'm in town. Don't look like that, I won't make a scene. I'll just look." She had not asked him to. She recognized this as the particular quality of his attention that she had been learning in the past 2 weeks, the way he noticed what she needed before she named it, and provided it without ceremony, and didn't make her thank him for it. She was beginning to understand that this was simply who he was. Not performance, not calculation, not the careful management of her opinion of him. He was a man whose care expressed itself in action, quietly, reliably, without requiring an audience. She was also beginning to understand that this was dangerous knowledge to have about a person. She stayed busy while he was gone. She finished the letter to her father, a longer one than his, full of the specifics she hadn't been able to tell him before, laying out exactly what she had written to Judge Booth and why. She told him to sit on the store's loan, to delay Pierce's people wherever he could, to buy as many days as possible. She told him that 6 weeks might be enough. She told him she was well and the baby was active, and Helena Burke had come down from the North Ridge to examine her and declared everything progressing normally. Which was a sentence she had not realized she'd needed to hear until she heard it and felt something in her chest release. She did not tell him about the cradle Wyatt had made and covered with a cloth in the storage shed. Some things were too tender to put in a letter. Wyatt came back in the late afternoon of the following day, and she knew before he dismounted that something had happened in town. His face held the same controlled quality it always did, but there was something underneath the control that was run so far unusual. She came off the porch to meet him. "Tell me," she said. He looped the reins around the post. "Pierce has gotten to Sheriff Malone." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Malone came by your father's store while I was there. He told Thomas that there's a formal complaint filed that you're being held against your will on my property, that you're in need of medical attention you're not receiving, that the child may be at risk." He met her eyes. "The complaint came from Edmund Pierce directly." The blood in her face went cold and then came rushing back hot. "That's a lie. Every word of that is a lie. I know that." He said it steadily. "Malone knows it, too, I think." He looked uncomfortable delivering it. "But Pierce is his employer in all the ways that matter in Silver Creek, and a sheriff who can't pay his deputies is a sheriff who finds ways to be cooperative. Can he act on a false complaint? He can come up the mountain and ask to see you. Verify your welfare. And if I tell him plainly that I'm here by choice, then there's nothing more he can do, legally. But Pierce knows that. This isn't about the law." Wyatt's voice was precise. "It's about what happens when Malone comes up here and Pierce has 3 of his men riding with him. It's about the disruption, the pressure, the message it sends to you. She understood immediately. Pierce didn't expect the false complaint to hold. He expected it to frighten her, to fracture her resolve, to remind her that he had the law in his pocket and she had a mountain man and a letter to a judge who may or may not have even received it yet. When will they come, she asked. Maybe 3. Malone will want to look like he's taking the complaint seriously without actually rushing up a mountain in the summer heat. He paused. I sent word to 2 of my neighbors before I came back. Jake Mercer, who has a spread about a mile east, and Cal Deaton to the north. Good men, both of them. They'll be here before Malone. She stared at him. You mobilized your neighbors. I mentioned the situation, and they volunteered. He pulled his saddlebag off the horse. Up here, a man who tells his neighbors there's trouble coming and then faces it alone is considered an idiot. She almost laughed. The shock and the anger and the fear were still moving through her, but something else moved with them, something warmer and more complicated, the particular sensation of being protected without being diminished. Wyatt. She said his name just to mark what she was about to say as serious. This is escalating. If Pierce is willing to file a false legal complaint, he's getting desperate. Desperate men make worse decisions than calculated ones. Yes, he finished the thought without blinking. I'm aware of that. Are you sure you want to keep doing this? Keep being in this in the middle of minus. Nora. His voice was patient, but there was something firm underneath the patience, something that had reached a conclusion and was done reconsidering it. We had this conversation already. My answer isn't different because the stakes got higher. She looked at him. She wanted to push, to make certain he understood the full weight of what he was choosing, but she could see in his face that he already did, had already measured it, had already decided. Arguing with that would not be respect. It would be the opposite. All right, she said. All right. He carried the saddlebag to the porch. Your father sends his love. He also sent you this. He produced a small bundle from inside the bag, a square of folded cloth, pale blue cotton. She took it and unfolded it, and found it was a baby blanket, imperfectly hemmed, the work of a man who had never saw a thing in his life, and had tried very hard anyway. She pressed it between her hands and did not cry, but it was a near thing. He made that himself, she asked. He was working on it when I got to the store. He tried to hide it, but I'd already seen. She folded it back carefully. She thought about her father's hands, which were merchant's hands, counterworn and ink-stained, working awkward and earnest over a needle and blue cotton because there was nothing else he could offer her from down there. She thought about love, the inadequate fumbling ways people expressed it when they had waited too long to start. Thank you for telling me, she said. Figured you needed to know that one. 2 mornings later, they came. She heard the horses first. She was in the kitchen making breakfast, and the sound reached her before anything else did, the particular rhythm of multiple horses on the trail. Her hands went still on the pan. She walked to the window. Counted. 6 horses, Sheriff Malone and 5 men, 3 of whom she didn't know but whose horses she did Pierce Ranch stock, the same brand as the hand who'd delivered the letter 2 weeks ago. Jake Mercer was already in the clearing, leaning on the fence post with his arms crossed and an expression of absolute unconcern. Cal Deaton was on the far side of the porch, whittling something, with a focus that communicated clearly that he would be here all day and had nowhere else to be. Wyatt stood in the center of the yard. He had not done anything dramatic. He had not buckled on a gun or positioned himself for confrontation. He was simply standing, the way he stood everywhere, with that particular quality of occupying space that didn't require props or posturing. Malone pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at the assembled mountain men with the expression of a man who had been hoping the situation would be simpler. Callahan, he said. Wyatt's voice was easy. Long ride up. It is. The sheriff glanced at Jake Mercer, at Cal Deaton, at the implication of community that they represented, and she could see him recalculating. I've got a welfare complaint to see to. You know that. I do. Miss Whitaker is inside. She's expecting you. He raised his voice slightly. Nora. She came out. She had taken care with herself, not performance, exactly, but clarity. She had braided her hair and put on her better dress, and she stood on the porch with her hands folded in front of her and her chin level. And she looked at Sheriff Malone with the steady, unbothered attention of a woman who had decided she was not going to flinch. Sheriff, she said. Malone dismounted. The Pierce men stayed on their horses, which told her something they'd been told to observe, not to act. Not yet, Miss Whitaker. I've received a complaint concerning your welfare. I'm obligated to ask you directly, are you here of your own free will? I am. No one is holding you or coercing you in any way. No one. Malone nodded slowly. He looked at her with something she might have called personal discomfort, the expression of a man doing a job he didn't fully believe in. Are you receiving adequate care, given the circumstances? Helena Burke has seen me twice. Everything is progressing as it should. She held his gaze. I am well, Sheriff. I am here because I choose to be. I have not been held, threatened, or mistreated in any way. If Mr. Pierce's complaint states otherwise, it is false, and I imagine you already knew that when you rode up here. A silence settled over the clearing. One of the Pierce men shifted on his horse. Malone looked at her for a moment longer. Then something moved in his face, something tired and a little ashamed, and he said quietly, "Yes, ma'am." I expect I did. He turned and looked at the Pierce men. He had to make a decision, right now, about which version of himself he was: the man who did what Edmund Pierce paid him to do, or the man who wore the badge because he'd once believed it meant something. She watched him make it. Complaint is unfounded, he said. Miss Whitaker is here by choice and in good health. We're done here. The man closest to Malone broad-shouldered, carrying the particular arrogance of someone who had always worked for the most powerful man in the room, straightened in his saddle. Mr. Pierce isn't going to be satisfied with, Mr. Pierce, Malone said, with an edge she hadn't heard in his voice before, is not the sheriff of this county. The man went quiet. They rode back down the mountain, all 6 of them, and Nora watched them go from the porch until the trail bend took them, and then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs were not entirely reliable anymore, and she needed a moment. Jake Mercer appeared at her elbow. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with the face of someone who had survived enough things to stop worrying about things that hadn't happened yet. You all right, miss? Fine, she said. Thank you for being here. Wyatt's a good neighbor, he said simply. A good neighbor's worth showing up for. He nodded at her and went to collect his horse, and that was the entirety of the speech. She sat on the steps and looked at the clearing, and breathed, and after a moment Wyatt came and sat on the step beside her, not close enough to crowd her, leaving her space, but close enough that the warmth of him was present, and they sat there together in the way they'd been learning, in this particular quiet that was becoming its own kind of language. He'll escalate again, she said. Yes, we bought time, but not much. No. He leaned his forearms on his knees, but Judge Booth will have the letter by now. The circuit is in 5 weeks. 5 weeks. Her due date had shifted slightly. According to Helena Burke, possibly 4.5 weeks. Possibly 5, the baby's position suggesting an earlier arrival than she'd calculated. She did not tell Wyatt this. She was still working out whether to worry about it. There's something I need to tell you, she said. He turned his head. About Calhoun Pierce. She had been holding this back, not from Wyatt, but from herself, turning it over in the back of her mind, testing whether it was relevant, deciding whether speaking it would help or only complicate. He came to see me before you and I, before the church. About 3 weeks before. Wyatt went very still. He came to the store. My father was in the back. Calhoun came to the counter and he told me, she kept her voice even. He told me his family would help, financially. He said if I would agree to leave Silver Creek quietly, go to his cousin's place in Wyoming, have the baby there and give it up for adoption, His family would pay for everything and give my father enough to clear his debts entirely. A long silence. He offered you a way out, Wyatt said. His voice was careful, precisely, deliberately neutral. He offered me a transaction, she said. My child for my father's debts. She paused. I told him no. Why are you telling me this now? She looked at her hands. Because he's going to try something else. Whatever he does next, it will be bigger than a false complaint to the sheriff. He's already tried silence, money, legal pressure. He's running out of moves that don't cost him something publicly. She turned to look at Wyatt. A man who's running out of moves starts making moves he can't take back. She saw it register in his face the way the full implication landed, moved through his understanding, and settled into something colder and more alert. You think he'll come up here himself, Wyatt said. I think someone will. Maybe not him, maybe men who work for him, men who don't ask what for. She held his gaze. I don't want you to be caught off guard. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before, not fear. He didn't seem built for fear in the ordinary sense, but a heightened attention, a pulling together of all that contained, deliberate energy into something sharper. I won't be, he said. I have the beginning of one. He straightened up. There's a man in Clearwater who owes me a favor. Someone who works in the county land office. I want to ask him something. What? Whether the Pierce family has any pending land filings that might be affected by a judicial inquiry. He looked at the mountain above them. Men like Edmund Pierce don't just have personal reasons for keeping their son's behavior quiet. They have financial ones. If there are land claims that would come under scrutiny, in the event of an official inquiry claims that required certain witnesses, certain records, then the judge's inquiry would threaten more than just Calhoun's reputation, she said slowly. Exactly, his jaw set. I want to know what we're actually sitting on top of. Because I don't think this is just about protecting a son's name. She turned this over. She thought about the particular ferocity of Edmund Pierce's response, the speed of it, the escalation, the personal involvement of a man who ran cattle operations across 3 counties and had 100 smaller problems he could delegate. Men like that didn't personally orchestrate harassment campaigns unless the thing being protected was worth more than the effort. How long to get word to Clearwater and back? She asked. A week, if the man's available, a week. She pressed her hand to her belly. The baby had been restless all day, shifting and pushing in the purposeful way it had when it was awake and energetic. She was 34 weeks along, Helena Burke had said. Give or take. First babies were unpredictable about timing. Then send word, she said. He looked at her. Are you right? You look... I'm fine. She said it with enough certainty to close the line of inquiry. Send word to Clearwater. What came back from the Clearwater land office changed everything. Wyatt's contact a man named Stuart Vance, whom Wyatt described only as someone who kept accurate records and believed accurate records mattered, sent a reply within 5 days. Wyatt read it at the table and went very quiet. Tell me, Nora said. He put the letter down. Edmund Pierce has 3 land filings pending in the territorial court. All 3 are for parcels along the northern creek that runs through this county. He's claiming them as abandoned grazing land. He paused. 2 of those parcels are currently under a homestead claim registered by a widow named Frances Abbott. She filed 2 years ago. Her claim is valid and on record. Nora felt the shape of it forming, and if his filings go through, she loses her land, her and her 3 children. Wyatt's voice was flat. Pierce has filed claiming the land has been unused for 5 years, which is the legal threshold for abandonment. The homestead record contradicts that directly, but homestead records get misplaced. Witnesses forget things they saw, if nobody raises a challenge before the circuit judge reviews the filings. The filings go through quietly, Nora said, and Frances Abbott loses everything. She sat with that. The cold, precise machinery of it, the way Edmund Pierce's power operated not through violence but through paperwork, through the patient manipulation of records and timelines, and the natural tendency of courts to favor men who could afford lawyers. Calhoun Pierce's behavior had given her a reason to write to a judge. And a judge who came to review that complaint might look at other things on the docket. Might notice 3 land filings and a contradicting homestead record. Edmund Pierce wasn't just protecting his son. He was protecting millions of dollars of land. He knows, she said slowly. He knows that if Judge Booth opens an inquiry on me, Booth will see the land filings. He knows any competent judge is going to notice the contradiction. Yes, this isn't about Calhoun anymore. It hasn't been for weeks. She looked at Wyatt. I'm not the threat. My letter is the mechanism that brings the judge up here. I'm the reason Booth comes, and once Booth comes. Pierce's entire land play comes apart, Wyatt said. Frances Abbott keeps her property. The filings get challenged. And Edmund Pierce loses the Northern Creek parcel that he's been building toward for 3 years. The full weight of it settled over her. She was not, in Edmund Pierce's calculation, a woman who had embarrassed his son. She was a loose thread that, if pulled, would unravel something worth far more than any personal reputation. He's not going to wait for the circuit, she said. Her voice was steady, but she felt it clearly, the particular quality of danger that arrived not as emotion but as understanding. He can't afford to. He has to resolve this before Booth gets here. Wyatt had already arrived at the same place. She could see it in his face, the tightened jaw, the focused alert quality behind his eyes. He had been running ahead of this since she'd warned him 3 days ago, and now they were standing on the same ground together, looking at the same horizon. He'll come in the next 2 weeks, Wyatt said, before his own court date on the filings. What do we do? He stood up from the table. He crossed to the window and looked out at the clearing for a moment, and she watched his shoulders, the way tension moved through them and was absorbed, contained, resolved into stillness again. She had been watching him do this for 3 weeks, and it still struck her the way he metabolized difficulty. Not by avoiding it, by standing inside it until he understood it completely. We don't wait for him to come to us, he said. I'm going to ride to Clearwater myself. I'm going to put Stuart Vance's letter and your original letter and every record you have in that tin box directly into Harlan Booth's hands before Pierce can do a single other thing. He turned. I want it on record, all of it, before any move he makes. I want the judge holding the full picture before Pierce gets a chance to frame it. Clearwater is 40 miles, she said. That's 2 days riding. I know. I'm 34 weeks along, Wyatt. She said it directly, because this was information he needed, and she was not going to soft-pedal it. Helena Burke said possibly earlier. He looked at her. She could see him recalculating, could see him weighing the 2 risks against each other with the focused arithmetic of a man who took both seriously. I'll send for Helena before I go, he said. She can stay here. Jake Mercer's wife will come too. She's had 4 of her own. She knows what to do. He held her gaze. Nora, I need you to be honest with me right now. Are you feeling anything I should know about? She thought about the baby's restlessness, the low, dragging ache she'd had in her back since yesterday. That was different from the ordinary pregnancy ache, more rhythmic, more purposeful. She had been telling herself it was the stress of the day, the tension of watching 6 riders come up the trail. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. Send for Helena before you go, she said. He went very still. How long has it been? I don't know. I'm not sure. She pressed her lips together. It might be nothing. It might not be. No, she met his eyes. It might not be. He crossed the room in 4 strides and went straight out the door, and she heard him calling for Jake Mercer before he'd even cleared the porch. And the mountain morning went on around the cabin with its enormous indifference to human timing while inside. Nora Whitaker sat at the table with her hand on her belly and understood that the circuit judge and Edmund Pierce and the land filings and all of it had just been moved, without ceremony, to second place. Helena Burke arrived within 2 hours of Wyatt's call, which told Nora that the woman had been half expecting the summons. She came through the cabin door with a worn leather bag over one shoulder, and the brisk, unhurried efficiency of someone who had walked into rooms like this 100 times and knew exactly what they required. She was 60-something, built like a woman who had never had the luxury of being fragile, with gray hair pinned back and eyes that assessed everything in a single sweep and wasted no time on what wasn't useful. She looked at Nora sitting at the table and said, "How far apart?" "I'm not certain there." "How far apart?" Helena said again, setting her bag down. Nora pressed her lips together. She had been timing them quietly for the past hour, telling herself she was gathering information rather than admitting what the information meant. 12 minutes, maybe 11. Helena nodded like this confirmed what she had already suspected. She looked at Wyatt, who was standing in the doorway with the particular stillness of a man holding himself together by an act of will. "You need to decide. Clearwater or here?" Wyatt looked at Nora. Nora looked at him. She could see the conflict in his face, not indecision, because Wyatt Callahan was not a man who undecided, but the specific agony of two necessary things pulling in opposite directions. Go to Clearwater and get the letter to the judge before Pierce made his move. Stay here, because she was sitting at this table timing contractions. Go, she said. Nora, Margaret Mercer is coming. There is nothing you can do in that room that either of them cannot do better. She held his gaze, steady and deliberate. But there is something in Clearwater that only you can do, and it has a closing window. Go. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was too large and too unguarded for either of them to address directly right now. And then he said, quietly, "I'll ride hard." "I know you will. The tin box, I'll have Helena get it." It's in the spare room. She had hidden it in the way he'd suggested, in a place she hadn't told him, so that if Pierce's men came to the cabin while she was alone, Wyatt could genuinely say he didn't know where it was. She'll know what to look for. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he said, "You're the bravest person I know," and turned and walked out before she could respond to that, and she heard his horse leave the clearing at a pace that said everything about how he intended to cover 40 miles. Helena came to stand beside her and put 2 fingers on her wrist. "He means that," she said. "I know," Nora said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it. The contractions were moving faster now. She could feel it, the rhythm tightening. "It terrifies me," she said honestly. Helena made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Good. Means you're paying attention." She helped Nora up from the chair. "Come on. Let's get you where you need to be." Margaret Mercer arrived 20 minutes later, flushed from the fast walkover, carrying a basket with food and clean cloth, and the efficient grace of a woman who had learned long ago that the most useful thing you could do in a crisis was show up with supplies and no drama. She took one look at the situation and went to work without being asked, and Nora was grateful for her, in the way you're grateful for things that work exactly as they should. The labor was long. Nora had known it might be. Helena had mentioned it matter-of-factly in one of their earlier conversations, telling her that first babies took their time and that the timing was not a measure of anything going wrong. Knowing this in theory did not make the reality of it simpler, but it helped. She had something to hold on to in the difficult hours, not comfort, exactly, but information, which was something she had always found more useful than comfort. She thought about Wyatt. She couldn't help it. She thought about him on the trail to Clearwater, pushing his horse hard in the summer heat, carrying in his jacket pocket every piece of evidence she'd spent weeks assembling: her letter to Judge Booth, Stuart Vance's account of the land filings, the dates and words from her tin box that she'd kept through 7 months of fear and silence. She thought about what it meant that she had trusted him with all of it, without hesitation. She had not trusted many people in her life. She had loved them, in the way you love your father and your town, and the life you grew up in, but trust was a different thing, a quieter and more costly thing, and she had spent most of her 25 years being careful with it. She thought about what he'd said before he left, and how he'd turned and walked out before she could respond. And she thought that maybe that was the most honest conversation they'd had, yet the one neither of them finished. Helena's voice pulled her back. "Stay with me, breathe." She breathed. 12 hours after Wyatt left, just as the summer dark was beginning to thin toward morning, the baby arrived. The sound of it, the first small, furious cry, the absolute certainty of a new person announcing their existence, hit Nora somewhere below thought. She had expected to be relieved. She had not expected to come completely undone. She had not expected the way her chest opened up, the way every braced and held and carefully managed thing inside her simply let go all at once. And she wept in a way she had not wept since the very beginning of this whole long catastrophe, except that now the weeping was not grief. "A girl," Helena said, and placed the baby on Nora's chest, and Nora put both hands around the small, warm, impossible weight of her and pressed her face against the baby's head and could not, for a long time, say anything at all. Margaret sat at the foot of the bed with her hands folded and her eyes wet, and the particular expression of a woman who had witnessed this miracle enough times to know it never stopped meaning something. Nora held her daughter and listened to her breathe and thought, "You have been with me through all of it. Through the church and the mountain, and the letters and the riders and the fear. You were there for every moment of it, and I did not let them take you, and here you are." She fell asleep with the baby on her chest as the first light came through the window. She woke to horses, not one horse, several, and voices, male voices, coming from the clearing outside with the particular volume and edge of men who have not come to be polite. Helena was already at the window. Margaret stood near the door, blocking it, which struck Nora as both brave and insufficient. "Who is it?" Nora asked. Her voice was rough from sleep and the long night. Helena turned from the window. Her face was controlled, but Nora could read the tightness in it. "4 men. I don't know them. They're not from up here." Nora was on her feet before the thought fully formed. Nora Helena moved toward her. "How long has Wyatt been gone?" 18 hours, approximately. Clearwater was 40 miles. A hard ride there, then finding Harlan Booth. Then she didn't know. She didn't know if he'd made it, didn't know if the judge was even in Clearwater, didn't know if any of the plan they'd built had survived contact with 40 miles of mountain road. "Is there a rifle?" Nora asked. Both women looked at her. "Wyatt keeps a rifle. Above the door," Margaret said. "But Nora, I know what I just did." She was already moving to the door, slower than she wanted to be, her body reminding her in no uncertain terms what it had accomplished in the last 12 hours. "I'm not going to use it. I just want to hold it." She took the rifle from the bracket above the door. It was heavier than she remembered firearms being. She checked it the way her father had taught her 20 years ago, in the back of the store, because Thomas Whitaker had believed that knowing a thing was always better than not knowing it. It was loaded. She went to the door and opened it and stepped onto the porch. The 4 men in the clearing were arranged with the particular deliberateness of people who had thought about where to stand. She recognized none of them. They were dressed in the manner of working men, but with an overlay of something too arranged, too coordinated, that told her they had been sent here with instructions. The one in the center, heavyset, sandy-haired, wearing an expression of authority he hadn't quite earned, looked at her, and then very deliberately at the rifle, and then back at her face. Miss Whitaker. That's right. She held the rifle loosely, not aimed, not threatening, just present. An object in her hands that had a purpose they all understood. "Who are you?" "My name is Dodd. I work for Mr. Edmund Pierce." He asked you to come to my home," she said, "the morning after I gave birth." A pause. Something moved through the man's expression, a flicker of something that might have been discomfort. She filed it away. He was following orders, not designing them. That made him a tool, which was different from making him her enemy. "Mr. Pierce has concerns about." "Mr. Pierce does not have concerns about my welfare," she said. Her voice was steady and unhurried. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical, a deep, total exhaustion that had, paradoxically, burned through most of her capacity for fear and left something very clear behind it. Mr. Pierce has concerns about a letter I sent to Judge Harlan Booth of the Territorial Circuit Court, and about what happens to 3 pending land filings when that judge reviews them alongside my account of Calhoun Pierce's conduct. She looked at Dodd. Is that a fair characterization of Mr. Pierce's concerns? Dodd's expression shifted. He had not expected that. He had come here expecting a frightened woman alone on a mountain, and he had found this. She could see him resetting. "I'm going to need you to come with us, Miss Whitaker," he said. His voice had lost some of its authority. "No," she said. Mr. Pierce believes he can send 4 men to the home of a woman who gave birth last night and compel her to leave against her will." She kept her voice absolutely level. "That is called abduction, Mr. Dodd. It is a crime under territorial law. And since Sheriff Malone was kind enough to officially document that I am here by choice, and in good health, a document that now exists in his office records, dated and signed, anything that happens to me from this point forward is going to be very difficult for Edmund Pierce to explain to a judge." She paused. "Especially a judge who is already looking at him." The clearing went quiet. One of the other men, younger, standing to Dodd's right, looked at his employer's representative with an expression that had just turned uncertain. She caught it. She pressed forward. "I want you to go back to Edmund Pierce," she said, "and tell him that this is over. Not because I'm asking. Because Wyatt Callahan left for Clearwater 18 hours ago with everything I've described, and Judge Booth will have it in his hands either this morning or this afternoon. Tell him the window is closed." She shifted the rifle slightly, not lifting it, not threatening, just reminding everyone it existed. "Tell him what happens next is entirely up to him." Dodd stared at her. She could see the calculation moving behind his eyes, what his employer had sent him to do, what he'd found instead, what the cost of proceeding would actually be against a woman who was clearly not operating from a position of fear. "We can wait for Callahan to get back," he said, trying to recover ground. "You can do that," she agreed pleasantly. "Jake Mercer and Cal Deaton are about a mile away each. I'd expect them within the hour once they see strange horses in my clearing. But you're welcome to wait." She met his eyes. "I've got coffee on." It was the coffee that did it, she thought later, the sheer mundane confidence of it, the imprecaver that she had so little fear of them that she was prepared to offer hospitality. Dodd looked at her for another long moment, and then he looked at the other men. And then he looked at the tree line to the east, as if calculating how quickly word of this could get back to his employer and what that conversation was going to cost him, regardless of what he did next. He chose retreat. "We'll be back," he said. It came out with less menace than he'd intended. "I'll be here," she said. She watched them ride out of the clearing and kept watching until the sound of their horses faded entirely. Then she went back inside and put the rifle back in its bracket and sat down at the table and put her head in her hands. Not because she was afraid the fear had burned off completely somewhere in the middle of that conversation, but because her body needed a moment to catch up with what her mind had just done. Helena came and put a cup of water in front of her. "You just faced down 4 men 12 hours after giving birth," she said. "I had a rifle. You didn't need it." Nora lifted her head. In the next room, from the small bed Helena had arranged, came the particular sound of a baby waking, that preliminary sound, the announcement before the demand, the tiny version of a person clearing their throat. Nora was on her feet before it escalated. She went and picked up her daughter, and the baby quieted immediately, turning her face toward warmth, and Nora stood in the morning light holding her, and felt the two things simultaneously, the residual shock of the confrontation and the absolute, grounding weight of this small person, and understood that she had never in her life felt so completely like herself. Wyatt came back at noon. She heard his horse at the edge of the clearing and knew the hoofbeat pattern immediately, and went to the doorway and watched him come in. He was moving fast, dismounting before the horse had fully stopped, and he looked at the cabin, and then at her standing in the doorway, and something in his whole body changed, a release, a breath, a reorganization of whatever had been holding him rigid for the last 22 hours. He came to the porch, he looked at her face, then passed her into the cabin. He stopped. Is everything? We're fine, she said. Both of us, he went very still. Both. She arrived about 6 hours after you left, Nora stepped back. Come see. He came inside, and she led him to the small room, and he stood in the doorway looking at the baby in the makeshift bed Helena had arranged, and Nora watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. The control, the constant, deliberate, beautifully maintained control simply left. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. It just went, the way a lamp goes out when there's no more oil, and what was underneath it was something open and unguarded and very, very old in the way that grief is old when it's been carried long enough. He turned away from the door. She saw him press one hand briefly to his mouth. She gave him the moment. She understood about moments. After a while he said roughly, "Does she have a name?" "I've been thinking about it." Nora looked at the baby. "I thought, Clara." If that, she stopped, uncertain suddenly. "If that's too much, I'll choose something else. I just thought." No, his voice was very quiet. I think she'd have liked that." They stood there in the small room together, and the baby made a sound that was between a sigh and a statement, and neither Nora nor Wyatt spoke for a long time. Then he straightened and cleared his throat and became, again, the functional version of himself. "I got to Booth," he said. "He was in Clearwater at the county office. I put everything in his hands directly. He read your letter while I sat across the desk from him." He looked at her. "He issued a formal summons this morning. Calhoun Pierce is to appear before the circuit court in 4 weeks. Edmund Pierce's land filings are suspended pending review." Nora absorbed this. The weight of it, all those months, all that fear, all that careful accumulation of dates and details in a tin box arriving now, in this quiet room, with the baby breathing between them. "Did Booth say anything?" she asked. "When he read it," he said. Wyatt stopped, seemed to be choosing precision. "He said the documentation was exceptionally thorough. He said, and I am quoting him, exactly, someone with a clear head put this together." She pressed her lips together. She would not let herself cry again. She had already used up a significant portion of her crying in the last 12 hours. "There's something else," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "Stuart Vance had done more digging than he told me in the letter. Frances Abbott, the widow with the homestead claim, Vance had already sent her a message about the land filing conflict. She didn't know. She had no idea Pierce was trying to take her land." He paused. "She's coming to give testimony at the circuit court." Voluntarily, Nora held onto the edge of the doorway. "She's a witness. She's a witness," he confirmed. "And she's angry. Vance says she's the most methodically angry person he has ever corresponded with." A very small, very real smile touched the corner of his mouth. "He says she has records going back 3 years. The machinery of it assembled itself in Nora's mind, her account, Frances Abbott's records, Stuart Vance's land office documentation, all of it converging on a circuit court date in 4 weeks. Edmund Pierce had spent months trying to manage a single loose thread, and in managing it, he had pulled on it enough to unravel something he could not put back together. "He's going to know it's over," she said. "He probably already does." Wyatt looked at the baby. "Which means the 4 men who came this morning." Nora told him about Dodd and the confrontation, quickly and without drama. She watched his face while she spoke, the way his jaw set, the way his eyes went through the sequence of responses she was coming to know: assessment, anger, containment, return to calm. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. "Then you faced them down with a rifle you didn't use and a line about coffee." It seemed appropriate. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. "It was too much of too many things at once. Where did you put them?" I told them to go back to Pierce and tell him the window was closed. She met his eyes. Was I right? Is it? He said. As of this morning it is. She nodded. She pressed her hand to the doorframe and let herself feel the full size of that. The window closed. The judge engaged. The summons issued. The cover-up unwinding in a territorial court where Edmund Pierce's money had no particular jurisdiction. What happens now? She asked. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He'll answer to the court. What comes of it depends on the judge and the evidence, and whether other witnesses come forward. He paused. Booth is a fair man. He follows evidence. What you put in that letter gives him plenty to follow. And Edmund Pierce? The land filing suspended. Probably permanently, given Francis Abbott's records. He looked at her steadily. He's going to lose the Northern Creek parcel, and he's going to spend the next year in litigation defending why he filed claims on occupied land. His voice was quiet. He's not going to be able to make anyone else's life difficult for a while. He'll be too busy managing his own. The baby stirred. Nora went and picked her up, and Clara settled immediately against her shoulder, making the small sounds of a person who had not yet learned to be uncertain about where she belonged. Wyatt. She turned to face him with the baby on her shoulder. I need to say something. He waited. What you did coming down from this mountain, what you said in that church, everything after. I want you to know that I understand what it cost. Not just practically.
I understand what it cost you personally.
To come back down into that world after choosing to be out of it. She held his gaze. I don't take that lightly. I won't take it lightly. He looked at her. His face was doing the thing where the control was present, but the man beneath it was visible around the edges. You don't owe me anything for it. I know that. She adjusted the baby against her shoulder. I'm not offering payment. I'm offering recognition. Of what it was, of what it is. She paused. There's a difference. He was quiet. He looked at the baby. He looked at the doorway. He looked at his hands briefly, the way a man does when he's trying to organize something he doesn't have the language for yet. My neighbor Jim Prescott got married last spring, he said finally. His wife's cousin is a circuit preacher, comes through every few months. Nora looked at him. I'm not saying. He stopped. Gathered himself. Tried again. I'm saying that there are options available that are, available. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who was exactly as uncomfortable as the situation warranted and was pushing through it anyway. If at some point they were of interest to you. She looked at him for a long moment, at the contained, extraordinary, profoundly awkward man standing in the doorway of a room he'd prepared for her before she'd agreed to come here. The man who had cleared a cradle from a storage shed to make space for someone else's baby. The man who had ridden 40 miles in 18 hours on her behalf and come home to the news that she'd faced down 4 armed men while he was gone and had only remarked that the coffee line was appropriate. Ask me properly, she said. He blinked. When you're ready, she said. Not now. Not today. I'm exhausted and the baby is 4 hours old and I think we both need some time to. She made a gesture that encompassed everything. The room, the mountain, the last 3 weeks, the magnitude of all they'd been through. But when you're ready, ask me properly. Don't tell me about a circuit preacher. Ask me. Something settled in his face. Something that had been held at a considerable distance from the surface arrived there, quietly, and she could see it plain as anything. All right, he said. All right. She turned back to the baby. Nora. She looked at him over her shoulder. She's beautiful, he said. Clara. She turned back to the baby because her eyes were doing something she had no remaining capacity to manage, and she heard him move quietly out of the room and back into the main part of the cabin. And the baby breathed against her shoulder in the slow, certain way of something that has arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. 3 days later, her father came up the mountain. She heard the horse and came outside with Clara in her arms and watched Thomas Whitaker ride into the clearing, and she watched him see her and the baby, and she watched what that did to his face. He was off the horse before it had stopped, and he crossed the clearing with a speed she hadn't seen in him in years. And when he reached her, he stopped about 2 feet away and looked at the baby with an expression so raw it was almost painful to witness. "Papa," she said. His eyes moved from Clara to her face. His throat worked. She's well, she's healthy." Nora shifted the baby slightly. "Do you want to hold her?" He held out his hands, and she placed Clara in them, and Thomas Whitaker stood in the clearing of a mountain man's homestead, holding his granddaughter, and made no attempt whatsoever to manage what his face was doing. "I heard from Pierce's man this morning," he said, when he could speak. "He told me the filing on the building is withdrawn." "No debt?" He looked at Nora. He said, "Mr. Pierce is no longer pursuing the matter." She nodded. "I expect not." "Nora," he looked at her with Clara in his arm. "I owe you. You came up the mountain," she said. He looked confused. "That's what you owe me, that you came up the mountain." She held his gaze. "Everything else we can talk about later. There's time." He nodded slowly. He looked back down at the baby with the expression of a man who had been given something he knew he hadn't earned and was determined to prove himself worthy of it anyway. Wyatt came out of the cabin, took in the scene, and walked directly to the horse to see to it feeding it, checking its feet. The work of someone who understood that the right thing to do right now was give these two people their moment and occupy himself elsewhere. Thomas Whitaker watched him do it. "He's a good man," her father said quietly. "He is," she agreed. "Better than I was to you." She looked at him. She thought about the cold biscuits and the averted eyes and the 4 sentences of defeat in a letter. She thought about the blue baby blanket, imperfectly hemmed, that was folded now in the spare room next to Clara's bed. She thought about all the ways people failed the people they loved, and then tried imperfectly to come back. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." He put his arm around her shoulders carefully, with Clara between them, and they stood like that for a while, in the summer morning. And across the clearing Wyatt Callahan minded a horse and gave them their time, and the mountain held them all in its patient, enormous quiet. 4 weeks passed the way difficult things sometimes do, faster than expected and slower than bearable, depending on which hour you were in. Clara grew the way first babies do when they are loved and fed and held without reservation, quickly, stubbornly, with a particular determination that made Helena Burke say, on her 3rd visit, that the child had clearly decided to make up for lost time. She had her mother's eyes, dark and steady, and something around the mouth that Nora couldn't account for and chose not to examine too closely. She was loud when she was hungry and quiet when she was content, and she had, from the very first week, shown a strong preference for being carried rather than set down, which Nora accommodated without apology. Wyatt held her on the 4th day, when Nora's arms were tired and she didn't want to ask, but her body made the request obvious anyway. He took Clara with the careful, deliberate hands of a man who understood that some things required total attention. And he sat in the chair by the fireplace and looked down at her with an expression Nora didn't witness directly because she had turned away to give him the privacy of it. But she heard him say something very quietly. That wasn't meant for anyone else. She didn't catch the words, she didn't need to. The circuit court date arrived on a Thursday in late August. Wyatt had ridden to Clearwater twice more in the preceding weeks, once to confirm with Judge Booth's clerk that the summons properly served on Calhoun Pierce, and once to deliver a written statement from Jake Mercer, who had witnessed the morning of Dodd's visit and was prepared to testify to it if required. Both trips he had made and returned within 2 days, and both times Nora had watched him leave with the same steady quality she'd felt the first time, the particular trust of letting someone go, because you believed they would come back. She was not a woman who had trusted that easily before. She was becoming one, and the becoming of it was the strangest and most significant thing happening to her, even with everything else that was happening. The morning of the court date, Nora was at the table feeding Clara when she heard a horse. One horse moving at a pace that wasn't urgent, but wasn't casual either. She recognized the tread. She had gotten very good at that. Wyatt came through the door, and she looked at his face and knew immediately. "Tell me," she said. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. Calhoun Pierce entered a formal admission before Judge Booth this morning. He crossed the table and sat down across from her. He acknowledged the relationship, acknowledged paternity, acknowledged that pressure was applied to your family to secure your silence. He paused. He did not contest the record you provided. The room went very quiet. Clara made a small sound and resettled against Nora's arm. "And Edmund Pierce," she asked. "The land filings are formally voided. Francis Abbott's homestead claim is confirmed and entered into the permanent county record." His voice was even, but she could hear something underneath it, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular quality of a conclusion that had been worked toward for a long time where it was supposed to arrive. Edmund Pierce is to appear before Booth in 6 weeks to answer for the fraudulent filings. His lawyer was in court this morning, looking like a man who had arrived expecting to win and found the room rearranged. Nora looked at Clara. She thought about 7 months of silence and what it had cost. She thought about the tin box and the careful handwriting and all the nights she had lain awake, wondering if keeping a record mattered. Records. She thought about Francis Abbott, whom she had never met, sitting in a territorial courtroom with 3 years of her own meticulous documentation, fighting for a piece of land that was hers. What did Booth say? About the admission? Wyatt stopped, looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. He said the record Miss Whitaker provided was the most precisely documented personal account he had reviewed in 14 years on the circuit. He said it was the account that made everything else possible. A pause. He said she clearly understood that truth on its own is not enough. You have to give truth a structure that can stand in a room full of people who would prefer it didn't. She pressed her lips together hard. Clara, sensitive to the quality of her mother's stillness, opened her eyes and looked up at her, with the ancient, considering expression of new babies. And Nora looked back and felt the whole long weight of it, everything from the church steps to this morning move through her and settle. "What about me?" she asked. "Legally, what does this mean for?" Booth has entered a formal finding that no wrongdoing on your part is or was alleged, and that the pressure applied to your family constituted coercion. He met her eyes. It's part of the court record. It exists. Anyone who wants to know what happened can read it in the county records in Clearwater. She understood what that meant. It meant the official story, the one that lived in documents. The one that lasted was not the story Silver Creek had written in that church on a Sunday morning. The official story was the true one. It was not everything. It did not undo the months of cold shoulders and turned faces, and the particular cruelty of a community deciding a woman was worth less than its own comfort. It did not give her back the version of her life she'd had before. But it was something. It was, in the language of courts and records and the slow machinery of institutional truth, everything. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You did this. We did this," she said, and held his gaze until he didn't argue anymore. The letter from Silver Creek arrived 2 days later, and it was the last thing she expected. It came from Martha Calloway, the woman who had looked away in the church, whose sourdough-bread credit Nora had extended for years, without a second thought. It was 3 pages long, and it had clearly cost Martha considerable effort to write. The handwriting started careful and became increasingly uneven as the pages went on, the way handwriting does when emotion is overriding the instruction to be neat. She wrote that she had heard about the court proceedings from her husband, who had it from the man who brought the weekly freight up from Clearwater. She wrote that she was ashamed of herself. She wrote that, on the morning in the church, she had known, in the way women know things about other women, that Nora was telling the truth by saying nothing, that the silence was protection rather than guilt, and that she had looked away anyway, because she had been afraid of what alignment with Nora Whitaker would cost her in that room. She wrote, "I have been telling myself for months that I had no choice. That is not true. I had a choice. I made the wrong one. I am sorry for it." She wrote that several other women in Silver Creek felt the same way, and that if Nora ever came back to town, she would not find the reception she'd had in July. Nora read the letter twice. She set it on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she went and found her paper and her pen and wrote back not a short letter and not a warm one, but an honest one. She told Martha Calloway that she appreciated the letter and that she understood the fear that had produced the wrong choice, because she had made choices out of that same fear and knew exactly what it felt like from the inside. She told her that apologies were worth more when they were followed by different behavior, and that she would be watching for the behavior. She told her that she was well, that Clara was healthy and growing, and that she was not ready to come back to Silver Creek yet, but that she was not certain she would never come back at all. She sealed it and asked Wyatt to take it down on his next supply run. He read the address on the envelope. He didn't read the letter. She hadn't offered it and looked at her with a question in his eyes. "Martha Calloway," she said. He nodded slowly. He seemed to understand that she didn't need his opinion on it and was not going to offer one. "It's the right thing to do," she said, not to him exactly. Partly to herself. "Probably," he said, which was exactly the right response. 2 days after that, 6 days after the court date, in the thick heat of late August, Frances Abbott came up the mountain. Nora heard about her before she arrived. Jake Mercer's wife Margaret had mentioned her in passing the week before, describing a woman who had shown up at the county land office in Clearwater with a box of record and expression like someone who had decided to stop being frightened and found the decision clarifying. Nora had formed an impression of her from that description and from Wyatt's account of what Vance had said, methodically angry, 3 years of records, and had expected someone formidable. What she had not expected was a woman approximately her mother's age, with the weathered hands of someone who had been working land alone for a long time, and eyes that assessed Nora in a single direct sweep and apparently found what they were looking for. She came to the porch and said, "You're Eleanor Whitaker." "Nora," she said. "You're Frances Abbott." "I am." Frances looked at the baby on Nora's shoulder. "Is that the one they tried to use against you?" "That's Clara," Nora said. Frances made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained warmth. "Well, she looks healthy. She is." "Good." Frances looked at the cabin, and then back at Nora with the particular directness of someone who had not ridden 40-plus miles to exchange pleasantries. "I came to say thank you, directly through a letter." Nora was quiet for a moment. "You should thank Wyatt Callahan's contact at the land office. I didn't know about your claim, I know that. Stuart Vance told me the whole chain of it." Frances met her eyes. "But your letter is what brought the judge. Your letter is what opened the door. My records walked through it, but you built the door." She paused. "I have 3 children. That land is their inheritance. I wanted to look at the woman who saved it and say thank you to her face." Nora absorbed that. She thought about the tin box. The 3 drafts of the letter. The careful, stripped-down language of the final version, precise and without self-pity. "I was trying to save something of my own," she said honestly. "Your land was larger than I knew. Most things are larger than we know when we start them." Frances looked past Nora into the cabin with an expression that was reading something in the interior, the quality of the space, what it said about the people who lived there. "You're staying up here? For now, and Callahan?" Nora looked at her. "What about him?" "He's a good man," Frances said simply. "Jim Prescott has said so for years. I didn't know him personally, but I know the reputation." She studied Nora with the frank assessment of a woman who had gotten old enough to say what she thought without dressing it up. "He's not a man who does things part way. You'd know that by now." "I would," Nora said. "Good." Frances nodded once satisfied. "That's all I needed to know." She turned to go, then stopped. "One more thing. I'm starting a petition in Clearwater for a formal review of all land filings where Edmund Pierce is a party going back 5 years. I've spoken to 2 other homestead families who believe they were defrauded the same way I was. She looked at Nora over her shoulder. If you're willing to let me reference your case, not your personal situation, just the court record, it would carry weight. Nora didn't hesitate. Yes, Francis gave her a look of genuine approval, the kind that came from someone who didn't give it lightly. I'll send word when it's filed. She descended the porch steps with the decisive tread of a woman who had a list of things to do and intended to do all of them. Wyatt appeared at the cabin door behind Nora. He watched Frances Abbott ride out of the clearing. She came herself, he said. She said she wanted to say thank you to my face. He was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? That I was trying to save something of my own, and her land was larger than I knew. She turned and looked at him. She said most things are larger than we know when we start them. He considered that. She's right, I know. Nora shifted Clara to her other shoulder. She's starting a petition for a review of all Pierce's filings going back 5 years. I told her she could reference the court record. Something moved through his expression, a kind of focused satisfaction, the particular quality of watching a stone land in water and the rings spreading outward. That'll reach further than you intended when you wrote that letter. Yes, she said. It will. They stood there together in the late August heat, watching the trail where Frances Abbott had gone, and the mountain held its enormous quiet around them. Then Wyatt said, "There's something I need to do." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something careful and deliberate, and underneath the deliberateness, something that was trying to be steady and not entirely succeeding. She turned and looked at him. He had taken his hat off. He was holding it in both hands, and she recognized the gesture she had seen her father do it, turning his hat in times of difficulty, and she understood it now as the physical habit of a man organizing his interior life. His jaw was set. His eyes were direct. "You told me to ask properly," he said. "When I was ready." She went very still. "I've been thinking about what that means." He looked at the hat in his hands, then back at her. "I think asking properly means being honest about what I'm asking and what I'm not. I'm not asking you to be grateful, or to stay because you have nowhere else to go, because you do. You have your father's house, and you have the court record, and you have more options now than you had 2 months ago." He paused. "I'm asking because I want you here, specifically you. Not because of Clara, or because of what happened in Silver Creek, or because I felt sorry for you, because I never did. I never felt sorry for you for a single minute of any of this." She kept her eyes on his face. He stopped. "Tried again. I felt like I recognized something. In you. The way you held your chin up in that church, and didn't ask any of them for a single thing. Not pity, not mercy, not even fairness. You just stood there and refused to be made small." He looked at her steadily. "I hadn't felt that recognition in a long time. Since Clara." He said the name simply, without making it larger than it was. "And I know it's fast, and I know the circumstances were not ordinary. I know there are good reasons to think this is just what happens when 2 people go through something difficult together. I've considered all of those reasons, and," she said, "and I don't think that's what this is." His voice was quiet and completely certain. "I think this is what it is, which is that I want you to stay, Nora. Not temporarily. Not until you figure out what comes next. I want you to stay because this is where you belong. Because this mountain is quieter and better and more alive with you on it." He held her gaze. "That's what I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man who had walked into a church to stand next to a stranger because it was wrong to leave her alone there. Who had cleared a storage room and put a good mattress in it before he even knew she'd come. Who had hidden a cradle under a cloth because he understood that grief and hope could occupy the same space. Who had ridden 40 miles in 18 hours and come home to the news that she'd handled 4 armed men with a rifle and a line about coffee, and had called it appropriate. She thought about the version of her life she'd had before July. The quiet life of a shopkeeper's daughter in a valley town, careful and contained, loving her father and her routines, and the particular safety of knowing what to expect. She had thought for a long time that safety was the most important thing, that the smallness of a known life was a reasonable trade for the uncertainty of a larger one. She looked at the mountain around them, the size of it, the indifference of it, the way it asked nothing of the people who lived on it, except that they be real. "I have a condition," she said. He waited. "Clara keeps her name," she said. "What I named her. That doesn't change regardless of anything else that changes." Something moved through his face that was too full to name. "I wouldn't want it to," he said, "and I keep the garden." "It's yours," he said. "It was always yours." She stopped. She had been going to list a third thing, something practical and manageable to balance the weight of what she was actually about to say, but she found she didn't have one. She was out of conditions, and yes, she said. He blinked. Yes, she said again, simply, because it deserved to be said simply and without ornamentation. "That's my answer." He stood very still for a moment, the hat in his hands, the late August sun coming through the trees behind him. Then he crossed the porch in 2 steps, and she had just enough time to shift Clara before he was in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. And he raised one hand and cupped her face in it, with the particular careful attention of a man who has learned that the things worth having are worth handling gently. He kissed her, brief, certain, warm, not a question. Clara, who had been sleeping against Nora's shoulder, chose this moment to emit a small, imperious sound that communicated clearly that she was awake and had opinions about being the least attended to person in the immediate vicinity. They broke apart. Wyatt looked down at the baby with an expression of absolute helpless affection that would have made Nora laugh at any other moment, and did make her smile at this one. "She has timing," he said. "She takes after her mother," Nora said. He held out his hands, and she gave him Clara, and he held the baby against his chest with the ease of someone who had been practicing for weeks and was no longer pretending to be awkward about it. Clara settled immediately. She had always been faster to quiet for Wyatt than for almost anyone else, which was a fact Nora had been noting and not commenting on for some time. "Jim Prescott's wife's cousin comes through in 3 weeks, he said. He was looking at Clara, not at her. "The circuit preacher." "I know," she said. "You told me about him." "I know I did." He looked up. "That was the circuit preacher version. I'm asking you the proper version now." She held his gaze. 3 weeks is fine." His shoulders released. That small shift she had learned to read, the tell that something braced in him, had been given permission to rest. He looked back down at Clara, with the expression she was coming to understand was him simply being happy in the way of people who don't make a performance of happiness. The preacher came in 3 weeks, on a Saturday, with the unpretentious efficiency of a man who performed necessary services for mountain communities and understood that the ceremony mattered more than the surrounding commentary. He married them on the porch of the cabin with Jake Mercer and his wife Margaret as witnesses, and Helena Burke, who had come down from the North Ridge, and Thomas Whitaker, who had ridden up 2 days early and was currently trying to maintain a dignity that the presence of his granddaughter made almost impossible. Nora wore her better dress and her mother's small pendant and had her hair braided the way she liked it, without fuss. Wyatt wore a clean shirt and had combed his hair and looked like a man who was taking the occasion seriously without taking himself seriously, which she had come to understand was exactly the balance to aim for. When the preacher said the words, Wyatt looked at her with the full attention he gave to everything complete, steady, present, and she looked back with the same, and between them, those words meant what they were supposed to mean, which was, "I see you clearly, including the hard parts, and I am choosing you anyway, and I will continue choosing you, and that is not a feeling or a promise, but a practice daily, the way you tend a garden." "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said. Jake Mercer made a sound that suggested he was enjoying himself. Thomas Whitaker was definitely not crying. Helena Burke was watching with the expression of someone who had brought enough people into the world to know that the moments that mattered were rarely the ones that looked like moments on the outside. Afterward, there was food. Margaret had brought enough for a small army, which was characteristic, and Thomas Whitaker held his granddaughter and told stories about Nora as a child that she had specifically requested he not tell. And Wyatt listened to all of them with an expression of private delight that she was going to address later, and the mountain held them all in the long gold light of a late summer afternoon. 3 months after that, the letter came from the territorial court. Edmund Pierce had entered a settlement in lieu of a full judicial review of his land filings. The settlement included financial restitution to 3 homestead families, formal withdrawal of all contested filings, and a significant fine payable to the territorial government. Francis Abbott's petition had been formally received, and a special examiner appointed to review all Pierce filings going back 7 years, 2 more than Francis had originally requested. Calhoun Pierce had left Silver Creek. Nobody seemed to know where he'd gone, and the people who might have cared were increasingly occupied with adjusting to a county in which the Pierce family's particular brand of power was substantially diminished. Sheriff Malone had, in a development that surprised nobody who had read his face on the morning he'd ridden up the mountain, submitted his resignation and recommended his deputy, a younger man with a reputation for following the law, rather than whoever paid his salary for the permanent position. The letter included a note from Judge Harlan Booth, written in a precise hand on official court stationery. It said, "Mrs. Callahan, the record you created made this outcome possible. I have been on the circuit for 14 years. The quality of documentation you provided is the exception, not the rule. If you ever find yourself in a position to advise others in similar circumstances, I would encourage you to do so. The truth requires advocates who understand how to make it legible. You clearly do." Nora read the letter at the kitchen table. Clara was in the chair they had moved in for her, sitting upright with the focused concentration of a baby who had recently discovered her hands and found them fascinating. Wyatt was outside. She could hear him in the yard, some task in progress, the steady sounds of a man working. She set the letter down. She looked at her daughter. She thought about 7 months of fear and one letter written 3 times until it was exactly right. She thought about Francis Abbott's box of records and the special examiner and 7 years of Pierce's filings under review. She thought about the particular quality of consequences, how they moved outward from a single point in ways you couldn't predict and couldn't control, and sometimes arrived where they were supposed to. She picked up the letter and went to the door. Wyatt. He looked up from whatever he was working on. She held the letter out. He crossed to the porch and took it and read it. She watched his face. She saw him reach Booth's note. She saw the small movement at the corner of his mouth that was his version of considerable satisfaction. He handed it back to her. She said, 7 years of filings. Francis is going to be busy. Francis, Nora said, is going to be magnificent. He looked at her for a moment. She had learned to read a great deal in his silences, in the particular quality of his attention. This one had the warmth in it that she had been finding there for months, the warmth he no longer made any effort to contain. "You're thinking about Booth's note," he said, "about advising others." "I'm thinking about it," she admitted. "And?" She looked at Clara through the open door, at her daughter studying her hands with total absorption. She looked at the garden, which had produced beyond what she'd expected from a late planting the kale and turnips, coming in thick and green, things taking root in ground that had been tended by someone who needed them to grow. She looked at the mountain, enormous and patient, and absolutely without judgment. She thought about women like her, women with tin boxes they didn't know what to do with. Women who had the truth and didn't have the language to make it legible, in a room full of people who would prefer it stayed silent. "I think," she said slowly, "that there are women in this territory who need someone to tell them how to write a letter." He was quiet. "Then I know a circuit judge who might be interested in receiving them." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the full steadiness of a man who had decided long ago that the right thing to do was worth the cost, and who had not once reconsidered it, and who was prepared to extend that principle as far as it needed to go. She folded the letter and put it in her dress pocket. "I'll need more paper," she said. He nodded. "Next supply run." She went back inside to her daughter, and the mountain went on with its patient business. And somewhere in Clearwater, a circuit judge was already thinking about the letters that might yet arrive on his desk. And somewhere on the eastern slopes, Francis Abbott was building a petition that would grow larger than anyone had originally measured. And in Silver Creek, the world was reorganizing itself around the absence of a particular kind of unchallenged power, finding new shapes the way water finds new paths after the rock is moved. The town had called her ruined. It had called her a cautionary tale. It had arranged itself in a Sunday church to watch her be made small, and she had stood in the front pew, with her hands folded over her belly and her chin level, and had refused, in every way available to her, to be made small. She had come down from that church holding a mountain man's hand, with a name for her child and the beginning of a plan. She had built the plan. She had executed it with patience and precision and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that the truth deserved a structure that could stand in any room. And now Clara Callahan napped in a chair in a clean cabin on a Montana mountain, and the garden was producing, and the judge had his letters, and Nora Callahan now, and gladly sat at the table with fresh paper and thought about all the women who were still sitting in silence with the truth and no language for it. She picked up her pen. She began to write,